$10,000, cash, now. The voice, husky, full of smugness and false authority, rang out like an irresistible command. It came from Officer Dave Miller, a white man in his mid-40s, wearing a dark blue airport police uniform that was slightly frayed at the collar and elbows. The lapel badge number 3481 glinted ironically in the light. He crossed his arms over his chest, his body leaning forward in a superior manner, his small gray-blue eyes narrowing as he assessed the man across from him with a scrutinizing look. And it will all be gone. This meeting will be as if it never happened. The other man, tall and well-built, in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, stood straight, motionless as a statue. His expression was completely impassive, almost a mask, betraying no emotion except for the intense concentration in his deep, piercing, dark brown eyes. Those eyes were silently observing every gesture, every tiny expression on the policeman's face. "Disappeared?" he asked again, his voice deep, controlled, and without a trace of trepidation or fear. There was only clarity and an implicit question of authority. What exactly is this thing the officer is referring to here? Officer Rick Thompson, Miller's young partner, number 5219, stood slightly back, almost blocking the only exit from this small area. He licked his lips nervously, but his eyes held the smug look of someone who believed he was on the winning side, following his senior. "Don't play dumb with us," Miller snapped, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips, revealing slightly yellowed teeth. "I know you. Always hiding something. The fancy clothes, the fancy leather suitcase. It's definitely not for nothing. There's always something fishy about it." He glanced sideways at the black leather Toomey suitcase neatly placed at the suit-wearing man's feet, as if the suitcase itself were evidence of a crime. "Just pay, and you can go. No more trouble. Or—" He paused, letting the threat hang, adding weight. "We'll be forced to do a closer search. A very closer search. And who knows?" He shrugged insincerely. "We might just happen to find something in that shiny suitcase. Contraband, maybe. A small packet of white powder stuffed under the lining. That'll be it. You'll be handcuffed right here in public, taken to the police station, a mugshot, in the papers. Your flight, your job, that important conference you were planning to go to? Forget it all. Your career will be gone in an afternoon." "Sounds like a well-considered offer," the man in the suit said, his voice steady and unwavering, but there was a coldness creeping into each syllable. The coldness of tempered steel. $10,000 in exchange for not stumbling upon contraband and ruining my life. A crime I did not commit. He emphasized the word, "did not commit," subtly. "You figure it out." "Smart," Miller said, impatience evident in his voice and the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot. "So, agreed or not? I don't have all day to stand here and play with you. The ATM is right over there, less than 50 yards away." He nodded toward the row of brightly lit cash machines in the main lobby. "Don't waste the law enforcement's valuable time." What led this seemingly successful, elegant man to find himself in a precarious situation, facing the blatant threat of blackmail from the very men who wear the badge of justice? What were these two police officers, Miller and Thompson, relying on? Confidence in their uniformed authority, deep-rooted racial prejudice, or simply bottomless greed, to commit this daring act in broad daylight at one of the world's busiest airports? Is justice powerful enough to penetrate the wall of silence of abuse of power, to find its way to this dark corner of O'Hare? Join us as we retrace the steps of the chain of events that led to this breathtaking moment, to reveal the truth and follow the relentless confrontation between the darkness of corruption and the fragile light of justice. An hour ago, the air inside American Airlines Flight AA-1422, a Boeing 737, from Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, DCA, to O'Hare, ORD, was still filled with the quiet of a just-landed flight. Passengers were gathering their carry-on bags, the click of seatbelts clicking. Among them, in business class, federal judge Marcus Vance, a 52-year-old African-American man with neatly trimmed gray hair and a stern but intellectual face, was slowly putting his laptop into his dark brown Gurkha leather briefcase. Judge Vance is no stranger to the American judiciary. He has served on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, for nearly a decade, earning a reputation for his carefully researched rulings, his almost unerring impartiality, and his calm but firm demeanor. The son of a history teacher and a nurse from Chicago's South Side, he overcame adversity and prejudice to graduate valedictorian from Harvard Law School, becoming a symbol of the rise and success of the African-American community. He is in town to attend the Seventh Circuit's annual Judicial Conference, a keynote event where judges, lawyers, and legal scholars come together to discuss pressing issues facing the justice system. He is scheduled to deliver a keynote speech tomorrow on accountability and implicit bias in the criminal justice system, a topic he has studied and pondered for years. As he stood up, adjusting the folds of his expensive charcoal gray Savile Row suit, his tall, erect figure exuded quiet confidence. His crisp white shirt, starched at the collar and cuffs, and his burgundy silk Hermes tie all spoke of his neatness and status. He was not ostentatious, but everything about him exuded quality and refinement. It was the result of years of hard work and achievement, but to some unkind eyes it was a sign of inappropriateness, a questionable wealth for a black man. Stepping off the plane and through the tunnel that connects to the terminal, Judge Vance joined the crowd moving toward the baggage claim area. His mind was still running through the key points of his speech, weighing each word, each example for persuasiveness and impact. He had a habit of almost unconsciously observing everything around him, a skill honed over thousands of hours on the bench, listening to testimony, assessing witnesses, and analyzing evidence. He noticed the hustle and bustle, the anxious faces, the smiles of reunions, but nothing in particular caught his attention until, not far away near a large stainless steel pillar, Officer Dave Miller and Officer Rick Thompson stood on duty. Their shift had been nearly 6 hours, and fatigue and boredom were beginning to show, especially on Miller's face. He yawned, leaned back against the pillar, and glanced listlessly over the stream of passengers until Judge Vance came into his line of sight. Miller had worked at O'Hare long enough to develop a skewed sixth sense, an ability to identify people he deemed out of place or suspicious. Miller's definition of suspicious was, unfortunately, often colored by deeply ingrained racial and class stereotypes. A black man wearing such an expensive suit, walking alone with such confidence. To Miller, that was an anomaly that needed to be checked out. He didn't think of him as a federal judge, a successful lawyer, or a businessman. Negative, stereotypical images of blacks and wealth immediately sprang to mind. "Look, Rick," Miller nudged Thompson in the ribs, his eyes still on the approaching Vance. "See that guy? Savile Row suit Gurkhas. Not cheap for sure, and black." His voice was low, full of meaning. Thompson, always trying to sound understanding and sympathetic, squinted. "Yeah, boss. Looks striking," he said, not quite understanding Miller's meaning but sensing something was off in Miller's eyes. "What do you think?" "I think it's worth checking," Miller muttered, his expression turning falsely serious. "Could be moving large amounts of cash, or worse. These guys are reckless sometimes. We should do a random security check, just to be safe." The random security excuse was a tool Miller often abused. Thompson nodded vigorously, straightening his back, trying to look professional. "Understood, sir. Random security checks." He felt a little excited. This was his chance to do something to prove himself to Miller. As Judge Vance passed by them, Miller took a decisive step forward, raising a white-gloved hand, blocking his path. The move was abrupt and rude, and a few nearby passengers glanced over. "Excuse me, sir," Miller said, his voice trying to be polite but not quite as condescending and demanding. "Random security check. Please show me your identification and boarding pass." Judge Vance paused, surprised but not confused. He had been through similar situations before, the scrutiny, the unspoken questions because of the color of his skin, no matter where he was. It was a sad reality he had learned to face with calm and dignity. He nodded silently, took his Mont Blanc wallet from his inside pocket, and extracted his Washington, D.C. driver's license and his American Airlines business class boarding pass. "Here, officer," he said, his voice even. "Anything in particular?" He looked Miller straight in the eye, a direct look, neither challenging nor evasive. Miller took the papers, glanced at the name and address. Marcus Josiah Vance, an address in the prestigious Georgetown neighborhood of D.C. This reinforced Miller's suspicions rather than reassured him. A black man from Georgetown, he thought. He studied the license photo, then looked at Vance's real face, as if searching for some mismatch. Thompson stood beside him, peering over Miller's shoulder, his expression tense. "We need to search your luggage," Miller said flatly after handing back the papers, offering no specific reason for the request. He gestured to the briefcase and suitcase. "It's procedure." "Baggage search?" Judge Vance frowned, his irritation more evident this time. "On what basis, officer?" "I have done nothing illegal. I have a right to know the reason for this search." He knew the Civil Rights Act and the Fourth Amendment. "It's airport security procedure, sir," Thompson quickly interjected, his voice a little high-pitched and obsequious. "We reserve the right to inspect any baggage we deem necessary to ensure the safety and security of all passengers. Your cooperation will help expedite this process." Vance took a deep breath, trying to quell the anger that was beginning to rise. He glanced at the two officers, assessing the situation. Arguing now would only complicate matters, delay him longer, and possibly cause him to miss his important meeting that evening. He also noticed the curious glances of a few passengers who had stopped to watch. He didn't want to cause an unnecessary scene. Besides, he had absolutely nothing to hide. "All right," he said, his voice returning to its usual calm, but he had already memorized the faces, names, and badge numbers of the two policemen. Miller, 3481, Thompson, 5219. "If it is absolutely necessary according to regulations." He decided to comply, but at the same time he began to be on high alert. There was something very wrong with the attitude of these two men. Miller and Thompson motioned for Vance to follow them to a nearby metal inspection table, where suspicious luggage was often searched more closely. Miller pulled on blue rubber gloves slowly, dramatically, as if preparing to handle a biohazard. "Please put the luggage on the table," Miller ordered. Vance lifted the Gurkha and Toomey briefcases onto the table. Miller opened the briefcase first. He flipped through the files, drafts of speeches, and handwritten notes with a ruthless disregard for personal property. His eyes scanned the pages, searching for any sign of hidden cash, secret codes, or anything suspicious. Finding none, he slammed the briefcase shut in frustration. Next came the suitcase. Thompson unlocked it and swung the lid open. He began rummaging through the contents. The neatly folded suits and neatly pressed shirts were all in disarray. He lifted each item, shook it, felt the seams, even opened the toiletry bag, examining each bottle of shampoo and toothpaste. He turned the suitcase upside down and dumped the contents onto the table. Then he ran his hand along the lining, searching for secret compartments or unusual bulges. Judge Vance stood silently watching, his face expressionless, but his hands clenched in the pockets of his suit. He felt violated and humiliated, but he knew that an emotional response would only serve them. He waited. After nearly 10 minutes of searching, leaving no stone unturned, Miller and Thompson were forced to admit defeat. No drugs, No weapons, no unusual amounts of cash. Just the usual paraphernalia of a traveling professional. Miller's face was etched with frustration and annoyance. He had been certain he would find something, but instead of apologizing for the inconvenience and letting Judge Vance go, this failure only served to further irritate Miller's pride and prejudice. He could not accept that he had been wrong, and the fact that this elegant black man was completely innocent made him feel uncomfortable. Another, much darker, more pernicious thought arose in his mind. If he could not catch him, he could create another situation, one more favorable to himself. Miller glanced at Thompson, a subtle but meaningful wink. Thompson, though a little confused by the sudden change, understood his senior's intention. He quickly gathered up the things that had spilled on the table, stuffing them carelessly back into his suitcase. "It seems we need a more private conversation, sir," Miller said, his tone suddenly changing to something casual and somewhat mysterious. "To avoid disturbing the others and to discuss some unclear points in more detail. If you would follow us this way, please." Judge Vance's heart pounded a little harder. He knew the situation was about to take a much more dangerous turn. "Where to?" he asked, his voice still cautious but with a distinct note of wariness. He glanced around, trying to locate the security cameras. "Just a more private area for conversation," Miller said, trying to sound casual, and gestured toward a short, dim hallway that led to an unmarked door. "It won't take long." Thompson stepped forward, opened the door, and held it open, motioning for Vance to enter. Vance hesitated for a moment, but then decided to face whatever was coming. He couldn't back down now. He stepped through the doorway, followed by Miller, and the door slammed shut behind them with a dry click. They were in a small room, perhaps a seldom-used waiting room or a makeshift office. The air was stuffy and smelled faintly of mold. There were only a few rows of dusty orange plastic chairs lining the walls, an old desk in the corner, and a single overhead light. The windows were covered. The sudden lack of privacy felt claustrophobic and threatening. Miller turned to face Vance. The pretense of professionalism was gone. In its place was a smug smirk and the impudent gaze of someone who had the power to kill. Thompson moved quickly to stand in front of the door, arms crossed, his face trying to look cool but unable to hide the tension. The trap was sprung. "Look, Vance," Miller began, deliberately addressing him by name, dropping the "Sir" honorific to show contempt and assert his superiority. His tone became insolent and challenging. "We know you're no small fry. Judging by the way you dress, by this briefcase, you're not short on cash. Am I right?" Vance stood still, his back straight, not saying a word. He just looked Miller straight in the eye, then glanced quickly at Thompson, assessing the situation. He realized he was isolated, facing two men who were armed, competent, and clearly had bad intentions. He knew he had to be careful. "Here's the thing," Miller continued, circling Vance like a predator, his tone both coaxing and threatening. "We could make a big deal out of this. Very big. Make a report about your initial lack of cooperation, about the suspicious items in your luggage, even though we haven't found anything concrete this time. Send a report to higher-ups. Keep you under investigation for a few more days. You'll miss out on all your plans." He paused, watching Vance's reaction. When he remained silent, he continued. "Or we could be extremely generous. Skip all the hassle. Shred all the records. Pretend we never met. You can leave immediately and continue on your journey." "And what is the price for that generosity?" Judge Vance asked, his voice icy. He knew exactly what was coming. This was a classic blackmail play built on abuse of power and prejudice. Miller laughed, a dry, mirthless laugh. "Smart. I like smart people." He stopped right in front of Vance, close enough that Vance could smell the faint scent of tobacco on him. $10,000, cash, clean, neat. Give it to me, and your troubles will be gone. It was the climactic moment at the beginning of the story. Thompson, standing in the doorway, chuckled nervously. $10,000, he added, trying to sound tougher than he sounded. That's a pittance compared to sitting in jail, hiring a lawyer, facing the press, and watching your life's work crumble, right? He tried to increase the psychological pressure. Judge Vance looked at Miller, then at Thompson. He felt a cold fury, a deep indignation at this blatant corruption. But he did not let the fury overwhelm him. Years of experience on the bench dealing with all sorts of criminals and complex situations had taught him how to maintain absolute control in the most difficult of circumstances. He did not panic. Instead, a bold, cold plan formed in his mind. He would not only get out of this situation, but he would make sure these people were held accountable. He would give them enough rope to strangle themselves. $10,000? He repeated the number, this time sounding surprised and hesitant, as if he were genuinely shocked and considering the offer. That's a lot of money. I don't have that much cash on me. How can I get it now? He was playing it safe, stalling for time. At the same time, in a very discreet way, his right hand was still in his suit pocket, his index finger hovering over the screen of his latest iPhone. With a barely perceptible movement, he activated the voice recording app. The recording light didn't come on. The screen remained black. "Stop acting," Miller snapped, his patience wearing thin. "The ATM is in the main lobby, not 50 yards away. You know that. We'll escort you there, or you can call someone to bring you the money. You have an hour, no more." He glanced at his watch. "Don't try anything stupid. Don't even think about calling the other cops or airport security. Everyone here knows everyone. We can make your life a living hell with a phone call. Do you understand?" He emphasized each word, convinced that he had the situation under control, that the man before him was nothing more than a frightened prey. "And if I refuse to pay that money?" Vance asked, his voice still sounding resigned, but his eyes were as sharp as daggers, analyzing the two policemen's every expression, every movement. Miller shrugged, a cruel, smug smile spreading across his lips. "Well, as I said from the beginning," he said slowly, savoring each word, "we'll have to do another search, much more thoroughly this time, and I have a good feeling we'll find something this time. A small packet of white powder, just a few grams, maybe accidentally dropped from the lining of your jacket or hidden in the sole of your shoe. It happens all the time in this airport, you know, especially with people like you." The slurs and racial slurs were now undisguised. He was so confident that he didn't need to pretend anymore. It was the moment Judge Vance had been waiting for. The evidence was clear, the direct threat, the blackmail offer, the racial motive. It was all there. He looked at Miller, then at Thompson, who was leaning against the door, his face trying to look cool, but his eyes showing undisguised concern. "Are you sure this is the path you want to take?" he asked one last time, his voice low and filled with an indescribable weight, like a final warning hidden beneath a calm exterior. "I am absolutely certain," Miller replied haughtily, greed overcoming all reason. "Now, where is the money? Or do you want to try your luck with the white powder packet?" Judge Vance slowly, very slowly, reached out his right hand from the pocket of his suit. Miller and Thompson tensed at the same time, their eyes fixed on his hand, their bodies slackening slightly in anticipation of his drawing a weapon or making any move to resist. The air in the room thickened. But what Judge Vance pulled out of his inside pocket was not a bulky wallet, nor was it a weapon. It was a smaller jet-black leather wallet, simple yet elegant in design, a far cry from the Mont Blanc he had used to hold his driver's license. He remained silent, his eyes fixed on Miller, then Thompson. He let the silence linger for a few seconds, letting the tension between the two officers build. Then, with a slow, deliberate gesture, he opened the small leather case. Inside, beneath a protective layer of clear plastic, was neither money nor credit cards. It was a gold-colored identification card with the majestic eagle seal of the United States federal government delicately embossed. Below the seal were bold, clear, unmistakable words that carried a weight no weapon could match. Federal Judge, United States Courts District of Columbia Circuit. Marcus J. Vance, Chief. Judge. The air in the small room seemed to have been sucked out. All sounds from the station outside suddenly disappeared. Miller and Thompson stood frozen, eyes wide open, staring at the card in disbelief. Miller's mouth was open, but no sound came out. His face turned from red to white, then to ashen in a matter of seconds. Thompson felt as if he had been struck by lightning, his whole body shaking violently, his knees buckling unconsciously. Their arrogance, their confidence, their airs of superiority were gone in an instant, like sandcastles washed away by the waves. In their place was utter disbelief, then pure horror as the horrible truth about the identity of the man they had just threatened, humiliated, and attempted to blackmail seeped into every cell of their brains. They had poked a giant hornet's nest, a power they could never have imagined. Officer Miller, badge number 3481. Officer Thompson, badge number 5219. Chief Justice Vance began, his voice now completely transformed. It was no longer the calm, controlled tone of a passenger. It was the voice of a federal judge on duty, cold, steely, and filled with legal authority. Each word, each syllable was pronounced clearly, slowly, echoing in the small room like the gavel of justice. I am Chief Justice Marcus Vance, en route to Chicago to preside over the annual judicial conference of the Seventh Circuit. You have just committed an unlawful detention, an unwarranted search, and then attempted extortion of a senior federal judicial official while I was traveling on official business. He paused, his razor-sharp gaze sweeping over the officers' faces, which were contorted with fear. This conduct is not only a flagrant and egregious violation of the Chicago Police Aviation Department's Code of Ethics and Regulations, but also constitutes multiple serious criminal offenses under both Illinois and federal law. He raised the cell phone in his other hand, the screen still black, but he knew the recording app was working perfectly. And just so you know, he continued, his voice not changing in intensity, our entire conversation in this room, including the offer of a $10,000 bribe and the blatant threat to plant drugs in my luggage if I refused, was recorded in full and clear. This recording will be used as evidence. The silence that followed Judge Vance's announcement was even heavier than before. It was thick, almost palpable. Miller leaned back against the wall, his body limp as if his spine had been ripped from his body. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead and temples, running down his collar in rivulets. His eyes stared into space, his expression a mixture of horror, despair, and disbelief. Thompson was completely broken. He fell to his knees on the cold floor, his hands clasped before his chest, his body shaking like a feverish man. "Judge, Judge," he stammered, his voice choked with fear and tears streaming down his pale face. "My God, please, please forgive me. Oh God, what have we done?" "No, it can't be." Miller finally managed to get the words out, his voice hoarse and broken. "Your Honor, Judge, surely this is just a terrible misunderstanding. A terrible mistake. We were just doing a routine security check. Maybe we were a little overzealous. A test, that's right. Just a test of the passenger's coping skills." The weak, preposterous, and laughably desperate excuse echoed in the room. Thompson, hearing Miller's defense, was like grabbing a life-saving straw, hastily raised his tear-stained face, and continued stammeringly, Yes, Your Honor. It was just a misunderstanding. Please forgive me. I was too young. I was just following Officer Miller's orders. I was so foolish. I have a wife and 2 small children at home. Please, don't ruin my life. I beg you." He began to sob, his pitiful pleas echoing in the quiet space. The scene was ironic and despicable. 15 minutes ago, they were the ones who assumed absolute power, confidently threatening, humiliating, and blackmailing a man they despised because of the color of his skin and his appearance. Now they were trembling, begging, kneeling, completely broken before that very man. The wheel of fate had turned a dizzying circle, and power had reversed dramatically, exposing the base and pathetic faces of those who abuse power when faced with real consequences. But Chief Justice Marcus Vance showed no sign of being moved by the pathetic pleading. His anger was not the kind of outburst that would be tempered by tears. It was a cold determination, an inescapable demand for justice and accountability. He had seen too many similar scenes in the courtroom, too many belated apologies after crimes had been exposed. He looked at the two broken men before him with a stern, uncompromising gaze. "Stand up, Officer Thompson," he commanded, his voice low but commanding, provoking no resistance. "Act like a police officer, at least for these final moments. Get your radio out and call your immediate superior. Immediately. Report an emergency requiring supervisory attention in Annex 3, Secondary Security." Thompson trembled, trying to stand on his wobbly legs. He fumbled with the walkie-talkie strapped to his waist, his hands shaking so much he almost dropped it. He stuttered into the radio, trying to relay Judge Vance's orders, his voice hoarse and filled with fear. Miller remained leaning against the wall, his face ashen, his eyes staring blankly at the floor, completely resigned, waiting for the inevitable. A few minutes later, hurried, determined footsteps echoed down the hall. The door swung open and Sergeant Eva Rostova strode briskly into the room. She was a woman of Eastern European descent, in her late 50s, with blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun, a stern face, and an extremely professional demeanor. She had been a supervisor at O'Hare for many years, and had a reputation for being tough, fair, but also strict. She stopped in the doorway, stunned by the sight before her. Her two subordinates, Miller and Thompson, one with a bloodless face leaning against the wall, the other standing trembling with red eyes. And in the middle of the room, a tall black man in a smart suit, standing straight with an unusual dignity she had never seen in a regular passenger. "What the hell is going on here, Miller?" "Thompson?" Rostova asked immediately, her voice stern and authoritative, her eyes scanning the room, assessing the situation. Before Miller or Thompson could utter any incoherent explanation, Judge Vance calmly spoke up. He took a step forward and held out his leather case containing his credentials to Sergeant Rostova. "I am Chief Judge Marcus Vance of the United States Court of Appeals for the 7th Circuit, Lieutenant," he said clearly, his tone respectful but no less formal. "I am here for a judicial conference. Two officers under your command, Officer Miller and Officer Thompson, have just unlawfully stopped and searched my luggage without any reasonable suspicion. After finding nothing, they brought me here and attempted to extort $10,000 from me. They threatened to plant drugs in my luggage if I refused to pay." He recounted the whole incident briefly, concisely, objectively, and accurately, down to every detail, without exaggeration or adding personal emotions. Sergeant Rostova stared at her federal badge, then at Judge Vance, then back at her two deputies, who were looking down at the floor. Her face was rigid, her eyes narrowed in shock, anger, and shame. She knew immediately that this was no ordinary passenger complaint. This was a scandal of the utmost gravity, one that would shake the entire police department. She glanced at the cell phone Judge Vance was still holding. "Your Honor," she said immediately, her voice filled with respect and professional seriousness. "On behalf of the Chicago Police Aviation Department, I offer my sincerest apologies for this unacceptable and disgraceful conduct by the officers under my command. I assure you that this incident will be handled as seriously, thoroughly, and expeditiously as possible." She turned to her two subordinates, her voice cold as ice, devoid of any emotion. "Miller, Thompson, you are both suspended immediately as of this moment. Hand over your weapons, badges, radios, and ID cards to me, immediately. You will remain here, not leaving this room, and not speaking to anyone, not even each other, until the internal investigation, IA team arrives. Is that clear?" Miller and Thompson, now broken and hopeless, silently followed orders. They removed their pistols, badges, radios, and ID tags from their uniforms, placing them on the old table with shaking hands. Their once proud police careers were now gone because of greed and stupidity driven by prejudice. Sergeant Rostova immediately used her walkie-talkie to report this particularly serious incident directly to the police department command and requested that a senior team of investigators from the Internal Investigation IA unit be dispatched to the scene. She also requested that the scene be sealed, the evidence be protected, and that all security camera footage in the area where Judge Vance had been, especially the security checkpoint, the hallway, and outside the third annex, be immediately collected. She knew that handling this case transparently and decisively was the only way to save the reputation of the police department. The internal investigation team, consisting of 2 experienced investigators, was on scene in less than 30 minutes. They acted with utmost professionalism and seriousness, fully aware of the sensitive and serious nature of the incident. First, they received a formal and detailed deposition from U.S. District Judge Marcus Vance. He recounted the entire incident again, from the stop, the search, the conversation in the anteroom, the blackmail offer, the threats, to the moment he revealed his identity. He also provided his cell phone. IA investigators, with his consent, copied the recording to a secure storage device, sealed the phone, and returned it to him, and compiled a detailed report of the evidence collection. Next, the IA took separate statements from Miller and Thompson. Faced with tough internal investigators, both men lost their cool. Their statements were contradictory and disjointed, trying to blame each other or cling to the misunderstanding and security check stories. However, those statements became completely meaningless when compared to the clear recording and Judge Vance's consistent, credible testimony. Meanwhile, technicians quickly extracted and analyzed the data from a series of security cameras. The videos, although silent, captured the entire process. Miller and Thompson actively blocking Judge Vance, the search of his luggage that seemed longer and more thorough than usual. The suspiciously led him into a side waiting room, and especially the image of Thompson kneeling before Vance after Sergeant Rostova arrived. The videos matched Judge Vance's testimony perfectly and reinforced the authenticity of the audio recording. The internal investigation proceeded at breakneck speed, yet was thorough and objective. Within 48 hours, the preliminary investigation report was completed. The conclusion was indisputable. Officer Dave Miller and Officer Rick Thompson had committed a series of serious violations, including unreasonable detention, unlawful search, abuse of official authority, intimidation, attempted extortion, and racial bias. Based on the report and the incontrovertible evidence, it did not take long for the Chicago Police Aviation Director to make a final decision. A brief press conference was held, announcing the immediate termination of David Miller and Richard Thompson. The termination was designed to send a strong message that the department would not tolerate any misconduct, abuse of power, or discrimination within its ranks. Miller's 15-year police career and Thompson's barely begun career came to an ignominious and scandalous end. But the story of Miller and Thompson's punishment doesn't end with the police department's firings. Their actions were not only a violation of internal discipline, but also serious criminal offenses. The entire case file, including the IA's investigative report, statements from the parties, audio recordings, and security camera footage, was immediately turned over to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. Prosecutors at the District Attorney's Office, after carefully reviewing the case file and recognizing the serious nature of the case, a police officer attempting to extort a federal judge, quickly decided to file a criminal case. A formal indictment was filed, charging David Miller and Richard Thompson with multiple felony counts under the Illinois Penal Code, including 1. Extortion, attempting to seize another person's property by unlawful threats. 2. Abuse of public power, taking advantage of position and power to commit illegal acts for personal gain or to harm others. 3. Threatening a public official. Even if the victim is the Chief Justice, the act of threatening can still be prosecuted under this crime. 4. Conspiracy to commit a crime. Agreeing to commit a crime together. Additionally, the U.S. Attorney's Office considered the possibility of pursuing additional federal charges, such as civil rights violation under color of law, since the officer's actions clearly targeted Judge Vance based on racial bias and violated his 4th and 14th Amendment rights. However, to avoid the complications of a parallel trial, they decided to work closely with state prosecutors, securing an appropriate sentence at the state level first. The criminal trial of former officers David Miller and Richard Thompson in Cook County Criminal Court has drawn significant local and national media attention. It is not just a case of police corruption, but also touches on troubling issues of racism, abuse of power, and trust in the justice system. Courtroom 502 was packed throughout the trial. U.S. District Judge Marcus Vance, as the victim and star witness, appeared in court with his usual calm and dignity. He sat in the witness box, facing the jury, and once again recounted in detail the events of that fateful afternoon at O'Hare Airport. Under the guidance of the lead prosecutor, he presented the facts in a clear, objective manner, without exaggeration or excessive personal emotion. He described Miller and Thompson's initial behavior, the unreasonable demands for papers and luggage, the rough search, the conversation in the anteroom, the $10,000 extortion offer, and the drug threat. His voice was steady, but every word he spoke carried terrible weight. The most important moment of the trial came when the prosecutor asked to play the recording from Judge Vance's phone. The sound was amplified through the courtroom's loudspeaker system. Miller's hoarse, smug, then greedy, threatening voice rang out clearly. The demands for money, the insults, the threat of finding white powder, all exposed the evil nature of the case in an undeniable way. The entire courtroom was silent, except for the voices of the past from the loudspeaker. The members of the jury listened attentively, many of them showing shock and anger. Miller and Thompson sat in the defendant's chair, their heads bowed, not daring to look up at anyone. The defense team for Miller and Thompson faced a nearly impossible task. They tried their best to downplay the seriousness of the incident. They grilled Judge Vance on cross-examination, trying to suggest that he might have misheard or misunderstood the officer's intentions, that it was just awkward banter, or that police were acting a little tough in the tense environment of an airport. They also tried to argue that the recording might not have told the whole story, or even questioned its authenticity, though digital evidence has been verified. However, all the defense attorney's efforts were weak and unconvincing in the face of Judge Vance's solid and consistent testimony and the undeniable physical evidence of the audio and video recordings from security cameras. Judge Vance's composure, integrity, and charisma added weight to his testimony. In his presentation, Thompson's attorney attempted to place all the blame on Miller, arguing that Thompson was a young, inexperienced officer who was pressured and following orders from his superiors. Miller's attorney attempted to portray a veteran cop who was overworked and stressed and who may have made a mistake in the heat of the moment with no real intention of extortion. But those defenses didn't hold up. The prosecutors in their closing arguments insisted that this was not a mistake, but a deliberate plan, motivated by greed and racial prejudice. They pointed out that both defendants actively participated in the threats and extortion, and that their actions were a blatant betrayal of their oaths to protect and serve the people. After several days of intense trial, filled with evidence, witness testimony, and legal arguments, the jury retired to the jury room. The courtroom waited with bated breath. After just over 3 hours of deliberation, a relatively short period of time for such a complex case, the jury returned to the courtroom with its verdict. The jury foreman stood up, his face solemn, and read aloud the verdict. For the defendant David Miller, on the charge of extortion, we find guilty. For the charge of abuse of power, we find guilty. For the charge of menacing, we find guilty. For the charge of conspiracy to commit a crime, we find guilty. Next, the representative read the same verdict for Richard Thompson. For the defendant, Richard Thompson, on the charge of extortion, we find guilty. For the charge of abuse of official power, we find guilty. For the charge of intimidation, we find guilty. For the charge of conspiracy to commit a crime, we find guilty. A sigh of relief came from the prosecutor and the supporters of justice in the room. Miller closed his eyes, his face drained of color, and collapsed into his chair. Thompson openly sobbed, his head on the defense table, his shoulders shaking. Their families in the back row could not hold back their tears of despair. A few weeks later, the sentencing hearing took place. The judge, a man known for being stern but fair, considered all the aggravating and mitigating factors. He heard the belated and tearful apologies of Miller and Thompson, and the pleas for mercy from their lawyers and families. He also heard a statement from the district attorney's office asking for a harsh sentence to reflect the seriousness of the crimes and to deter similar behavior in the future. Finally, the presiding judge looked directly at the two defendants, his voice solemn and weighty, echoing throughout the courtroom. David Miller and Richard Thompson, you were entrusted with a sacred responsibility to protect the public, uphold the law, and serve your community with honor and integrity. But you betrayed that trust in the most blatant manner. You used the power and uniform you were given to terrorize, humiliate, and attempt to extort an honest citizen, a man you targeted solely because of the color of his skin and appearance based on vile and shameful prejudices. The judge paused, looked at the file before him, and then looked back at the defendants. Your actions have not only caused deep hurt to the victim, Judge Vance, but have also severely damaged the reputations of the thousands of dedicated police officers who serve their communities day and night. They have eroded the core of public trust in law enforcement, a trust that is already fragile. No excuse, no belated repentance can undo that fact. Given the seriousness of the charges, the gross abuse of trust, and the profound negative impact on the community and the justice system, the judge continued, the court sentences defendant David Miller to 8 years in prison. The court sentences defendant Richard Thompson to 7 years in prison. The sentences will run concurrently. The judge's gavel struck the table with a resounding, dry crack, officially ending the careers, honor, and freedom of the two former police officers. Miller and Thompson were handcuffed and led out of the courtroom by courthouse police officers in heavy silence, leaving behind tears and broken hearts. Justice, though sometimes twisted and challenging, had finally been served in a strict and clear manner. After completing his witness duty, Chief Justice Marcus Vance returned to his duties on the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. The O'Hare incident, while troubling and causing much righteous indignation, did not dampen his spirits or weaken his faith in the legal system he had devoted his life to. On the contrary, it strengthened his resolve to fight for fairness, equality, and accountability in all aspects of the justice system. His speech at the judicial conference that year, already carefully prepared, now carried an additional layer of personal meaning and practical weight. He did not directly recount his own story, but those experiences permeated his words and arguments about the dangers of implicit bias, the need for close oversight of law enforcement, and the importance of creating a justice system that is truly fair to all, regardless of race or social status. Over the years, Judge Vance continued his illustrious career, respected by his peers, lawyers, and the public, not only for his legal brilliance and fair decisions, but also for his unwavering integrity and quiet but powerful courage. He rarely spoke publicly about the airport incident, viewing it as a sad but necessary chapter in his journey. He also became increasingly active in advising police reform commissions and promoting bias awareness and ethical communication training programs for law enforcement across the country. The Miller and Thompson scandal sent shockwaves through the Chicago Police Aviation Department and the Chicago Police Department as a whole. It exposed serious flaws in management, oversight, and training. To restore public trust and prevent similar incidents from recurring, the department's leadership was forced to implement a series of sweeping and costly reforms. Mandatory and periodic training programs on ethics, anti-racism, identifying implicit bias, non-confrontational communication, and civil rights were implemented more vigorously than ever before. Body cam policies were also tightened, requiring continuous video recording of all interactions with the public. Sergeant Eva Rostova, thanks to Judge Vance's professional, decisive, and honorable handling of the case, was promoted and became a model of ethical leadership within the force. The story is not simply a fitting sentence for two corrupt and degenerate individuals. It is a profound and costly lesson about the unpredictable consequences of abusing the power entrusted to one and allowing harmful prejudices about race and class to poison one's thoughts and actions. It resonates as a resounding affirmation that in a society governed by the rule of law, no one, no matter how powerful the uniform, is allowed to stand above the law or trample on the rights and dignity of others. How did Judge Vance's journey to justice, from the moment he faced the blatant abuse of power to seeing the perpetrators pay the price before the law, leave you with what emotions? What are your thoughts on the role of implicit bias and accountability in law enforcement in particular and society in general after hearing this story? We look forward to receiving your sincere sharing and thoughtful reflections in the comments section below.